Robert, you're good to go, so please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Dan. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me, even if I can't hear you particularly well. So what I've got about 7 or 8 minutes to talk through the sort of Welcome Trust experience of making open access payments, share some data with you, and really, I think, in essence, look at the costs we are paying for open access, look at the services we're getting, and sometimes they're not as good as we would hope they would be. And then I think I'm going to end with some options for how we might consider trying to make the marketplace which is less dysfunctional. I realise that's quite a pejorative term, but the data I'm going to show suggests that the market is not working massively effectively. So start off with just some numbers. There's a lot of numbers on that screen, and I apologise for that. But the key takeaways are at the bottom of the slide, which shows that over the past year, we do an analysis every single year of our APC spend. We can see that the actual number of articles which has been routed through an author pays model has increased quite significantly, up by 20%. And in this same period, there's been relatively sort of very little inflation, less than a 1% increase in the average APC. So that's looking good. And I should say, though it's not on that slide, generally our compliance is looking reasonably healthy now. We have compliance of typically every month well over 70%. So we're looking quite good. So that's the good news. We then look to see actually where we spending this money, and we have a piece of software which tries to identify whether the journal is a hybrid journal, and it does that by dint of it not being in DOAJ. So if a journal was in DOAJ, we assume it's a fully open access journal. If it's not, we make the assumption it's a hybrid. It may not be foolproof, but it's good enough to get some sort of data from us. And as you can see there, we're showing that typically Wellcome authors, about 3/4 of Wellcome funded publications are appearing in hybrid journals, and about 1/4 in fully open access journals. And that can be from the traditional open access publishers, if you can call them that, the likes of Public Library of Science, BMC, but also open access, fully open access journals published by the more subscription-based journals, Elsevier, Wiley, and so on. What is key there, and what I've put in red, is the fact that the average APCs for hybrid in this cohort were 64% higher than the average APC levied by fully open access titles. So that talks to my assertion about a slightly dysfunctional market. If we look again at another busy slide by volume, you can see that at the moment we're spending about 40% of our spend with the two biggest publishers, Elsevier and Wiley, and the average APCs, even though they're fully open access journals, are typically more expensive. So if you look at the first line of that I've highlighted in yellow, the average APC for fully open access journals in Elsevier is just shy of 3,000. For PLOS, it's 1,100, and essentially it's 1,400. And then the other thing we do, in addition to looking to see where our money is going, our publishers actually doing what we require them to do when we make article processing charge available. So typically that means we require the article to be deposited in PubMed Central, and it must have a CC BY license. So the typical things. So a lot of numbers on that slide. The key ones to notice are, even though 100% of these articles are ones which we have paid an article processing charge for, when we did the analysis, 13% of those papers were not in PubMed Central or Europe PubMed Central. And I think amongst that cohort, there were some ahead of print publications. I'll just briefly explain. PubMed Central only takes an article once it's got a final version, final publication date. So there were some articles which were ahead of print, we'd paid, but they weren't quite in PMC, and that obviously was not the fault of the publisher, that's the policy of PMC. But if we remove those papers from that cohort, there's still over 227 papers which we had paid for, had been published, and were not in our repository, and that equates to just shy of £500,000. And I don't know what other sort of service industry you would pay that sort of money and not expect to receive the product you paid for. We also looked at licenses. Are they compliant with our policy? Again, the figure there was almost 40% of the articles in this cohort did not have the license we require. So the types of problems, just to elaborate a little bit, obviously there were some papers which, in terms of the license data, they had been submitted before our April the 1st 13 date. So they were we'd assumed that in this cohort, all the papers published would have been submitted before April 13. That wasn't the case, so that was still an issue. The other problem you can see in that list there's some mismatch between the author, the institution saying they paid an APC, the publisher saying no, they hadn't, and that type of issue. And there are an awful lot of what I call contradictory license data. And I'm just going to show you one. And I just picked this just pretty much at random. This is an article. If you can see the bit in yellow, it looks, from a human readable perspective, looks pretty good. It's a Creative Commons CC BY version 3 license. Okay. But then you go and look at the XML, which is what our piece of software does, and you see you've got a choice of licenses here. If you want, you can have the CC BY NCSA, or the text says it's CC BY. So we've got all these types of issues still. So it's not quite a seamless system. So I want to, in the last 2 minutes, just run through some of the options. So the contention the story I'm telling is one where hybrids are more expensive, and the problems we've had with getting the content into PMC and so forth is almost been exclusively related to hybrids. So what can we do about this? Well, the approach we've taken for the last 10 years or so is do nothing, just trust the market to do something. I'm not convinced that is an effective way forward. We could do either option 2 or 3, which is one would be do not fund hybrids. So we could follow the model of the Norwegian Research Council, or DFG, and just say, no, you can't use these funds to pay hybrids. Again, I think that's a very blunt instrument, and as the data I've presented shown, that 3/4 of Wellcome authors want to publish with hybrid titles. So option 3, we could implement a cap. We could do the approach of the Austrians and say, okay, we're only prepared to pay, and you pick a number. Again, I feel that is rather blunt, and I fear that wherever you set it, for those who were below that cap, they would rise to it, and those already above it would say, in many cases rightly so, that they can't provide that service for that fee. So I think we have to be a bit smarter. So I suppose the other options we're looking at. So first of all, option 4 is this concept of a poor service cap. So this is where a publisher systematically, in our view, doesn't provide the services we require. And at that point, we would do like we do with grants. We would withhold a certain percentage of the article processing charge, and only release that final 10, 20, 30%, whatever it is, once we had been assured that the services we had paid for had been delivered. And then finally, the other 2 options. One is we need to try and get authors to have some concept of price, and to do that, they need some concept of the value a particular journal is delivering for that price. So one idea is to develop some sort of journal scorecard. So here you wouldn't have a single metric, but you would say, okay, this journal perhaps does peer review within X days, does hygiene checks, i.e. checks for image manipulation, does plagiarism detection. This journal has a rejection rate of X. This journal has a citation score of Y. So you could combine a whole raft of data and show that to authors. And then based on that, what you could eventually presumably do is then try and create a value metric, which would try to set a value of what a journal provides. And then you could at that point say, if you score a value of 5, we would have a cap of $5,000. If you have a cap of 1, if we had a score of 1, we would only give you 1,000. I'm very much aware that a single metric could be as mistreated and misused as the journal impact factor. But I think, let's say, the option of just doing a single cap or banning hybrids doesn't seem particularly scalable or particularly effective. So that's it. I've gone over my 8 minutes. Apologies for that. There's more data on this slide, and the slides are available on ClickShare. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert.